It was on a morning when the Thames lay shrouded in a chill vapour, and the rumbling of drays upon Oxford Street came to us as if from the bottom of a tea kettle, that Inspector Lestrade, with his hat beaded by mist and his shoulders powdered with the ash of the fog, was shown up to our sitting-room at Baker Street. My companion had just concluded a brief chemistry experiment. There was a faint odour of acetic acid in the air, and had sunk into his chair with the languor which so often followed upon mental exaltation. He regarded our visitor with that half-closed, feline gaze in which indifference and appetite seemed curiously mingled. "Bad enough to bring you through this weather, Inspector?" said Holmes without rising. "You have been along the river this morning? The left cuff of your coat is gritted with coal ash, uncommon on the pavements of Marylebone, yet plentiful upon the towpaths, and the salt damp has buckled the leather of your boots. Besides," he waved a languid hand, "the particular perfume of tar and fennel upon your person argues a wharf, and not a pleasure steamer." Lestrade sent me one of his dry smiles. "Upon my word, Mr. Holmes, the river itself might take you into its confidence. Yes, I've come from the Surrey side, Merchant's Wharf, Lower Shadwell. There's a dead man there who would be alive if he'd had the benefit of your nose before dawn." "Sit down, Lestrade," said Holmes, the light leaping into his eyes. "And pray do not omit detail. The river is a palimpsest. What is written upon it fades quickly." The inspector perched upon the edge of our table, as if he feared the armchair might detain him. "Name of the deceased is Mr. Ambrose Phippen, an importer of Mediterranean goods, dried fruits, anise, fennel, that sort. A respectable house, Phippen and Lyle. Kept an office on the first floor of a warehouse at Merchant's Wharf. At 5:30, the night watchman, a fellow named Macready, found him lying upon the office floor with his head split. Clean work, with a short iron bar or a belaying pin, says the surgeon. There's blood enough to paint a sloop, yet not a sign of struggle beyond a smashed inkwell. The room was locked on the inside, the key found in the victim's own pocket, and the single window upon the river was latched and barred. "A locked room, Watson?" murmured Holmes, his fingers steepled. "We have not had a decent one since the affair of the Bishopsgate pawnbroker." Lestrade continued with the dogged brevity which was his manner when he felt the ground of authority firm beneath him. "No footprints on the stair, but Phippen's and the watchman's after the discovery. No second key, no marks upon the window, save for river grime. The desk shows a ledger open to yesterday's reckonings and a torn-out leaf, the stub still ragged in the binding. His watch in the waistcoat, chain intact. A lacquered cash tin upon the shelf without so much as a farthing missing. If it was robbery, it was the daintiest-handed thief I've seen in 20 years. Holmes drifted to the window and traced with a finger the path of some imagined droplet upon the pane. "You spoke of fennel and anise. I perceive that fragrance now, though faint. Is the warehouse piled with such goods?" "Bags upon bags of it. The whole place smells like a confectioner's dream." Lestrade's lip curled. "And there's this, Mr. Holmes." Macready swears he heard a barge nudge the piles at 5:15, the tide turning just then, but saw none. The river was clotted with fog. Another man, a lighterman named Briggs, says he'd been waiting for a consignment and watched the warehouse wall for half an hour prior. He swears no one went in or out at that time. And yet here we are, a murdered merchant in a room no man could enter or leave. Holmes glanced swiftly to the mantel, took up his clay pipe, and then laid it down again untouched, a sure sign with him that his mind was fixed elsewhere. "What of Phippen's associates?" "Partner is a Mr. Lionel Lyle, a careful, clerkish gentleman, as per his look. Gave me to understand that Phippen had lately shifted their custom to a new shipper from Trieste. Also a rival importer, Aloysius Kern, keeps a yard 2 doors down. They had, it seems, some ill blood over a consignment of Smyrna figs. The widow, or near enough, for Phippen was a bachelor, his married sister, Mrs. Lydia Harrow, has a house in Bayswater. She wept in a genteel way and told me Phippen had taken to walking late along the river of an evening, fretting over a discrepancy in his accounts which he would not share. The junior clerk, Harold Pettigrew, looks pale enough to faint and too frightened to lie, but I'd wager a sovereign the torn ledger leaf has something to do with him. Holmes's head shot round. Torn from the day's reckoning, you say? Torn clean or jagged? Jagged, the sort of roughness a man makes when he snatches rather than cuts. Excellent. And the ink from the smashed inkwell, was it spattered across the floor in a fan, or pooled thick and slow? Lestrade blinked. Pooled by the desk. Why? Holmes's mouth twitched. Because a falling hand and a falling bottle do not write the same script upon a floorboard, Inspector. Continue. That's near all. Save a queer thing. Upon the office carpet there's a patch of tar or pitch, like what you find on a ship's rope, pressed in the shape of a half-boot, just the toe and a suggestion of the instep. But the surgeon says the dead man wore soft-soled boots and there's no corresponding mark anywhere else. One stray print, pointing toward the window, as if a ghost had put its foot down and considered the river. Holmes laughed softly, a murmur really like the purr of a cat that scents cream. A single half-print is often more eloquent than a regiment marching in step. Tell me, was there a smell of lamp oil upon the man's clothing? And don't trouble to answer. The way your brow rises is a sufficient confession that you did not sniff. I'm not a hound, Mr. Holmes. No, but the river is. He turned, suddenly all decision. Watson, your coat. Inspector, you shall take us straight away. This case has already begun to declare itself, and the tide, like truth, waits for no man. Lestrade stood, the relief in him tempered by scepticism. You think you can make something of it, then? Between us, the Commissioner would be glad to lay a neat explanation before the papers. The city is nervous enough with strikes on the docks and a rumour, only a rumour, of contraband moving under official noses. Holmes's expression became as blank as the white of an egg. Ah, a rumour. Pray keep such culinary whispers for your next breakfast, Inspector. The public appetite is delicate. We shall concern ourselves with facts. A dead merchant in a locked room, a torn page, a single tarred half-print, fennel in the air, the soft nudge of a barge in fog. Each is a stitch. Together they will sew our bag. While Mrs. Hudson fetched my ulster, and I checked the charge in my service revolver, for though I have long ceased to fancy myself a man of action, I have learned that the presence of a pistol has a calming effect upon the nerves. Holmes moved with a hasty precision about the room. He plucked from his drawer a magnifying lens, a small tape, and a paper envelope into which he slid a slip of card, already spotted, as if in anticipation, with resinous grains. Observing my curiosity, he tucked the envelope away with a smile. An experiment to be tried at the scene, my dear fellow. If the inspector is correct, we shall have a demonstration in sticky syllogism. Sticky? Began Lestrade, but Holmes had already taken his hat and violin case. The latter, as I have had frequent cause to note, contained upon occasion as little music as a barber's basin contains water. We descended to the street. The fog lay in long folds between the houses, and the lamps made globes upon it, as a child might blow from soap. A growler bore us cityward, the horses' flanks dark with damp, and Holmes, in that fit of abstraction which seized him before a hunt, stared into the milky gloom, as though the river itself might write its confession upon the glass. Mr. Phippen, he said at last, had two fears last night. One he confided to his sister, the fear of a discrepancy. The other, which he confided to the floorboards, was of something that comes by water. Men who traffic with the tide come to trust and to dread it in equal measure. When such a man dies, with his window latched and his key in his pocket, we must look for his murderer, not where the door stands, but where the river breathes. "Then you believe," I began. "I believe nothing, Watson. I infer, and the inferences await the courtesy of inspection." He tapped the violin case lightly. "There is an old Greek fable about a fox who left a print with one paw, and none with the other three. The moral escapes me, but the method does not." Lestrade snorted. "If we are to hunt foxes in Shadwell, I'll need a pack." "You have one," said Holmes. "Two will suffice." And with that, as the cab rattled down into the darker arteries of the east, we felt the river draw us, as a great patient animal draws any floating thing toward its heart. The cab set us down in a lane where the fog came in drifts like torn gauze, and the river answered with the muffled clink of chain upon timber. Merchant's Wharf loomed in brick and blackened beams, its windows blind and sweating. A constable paced before the open door, and at Lestrade's word we were shown along a sour corridor to a stair of tarred wood that stuck faintly to the soul. Holmes touched the handrail, raised a glistening fingertip, and sniffed with a small nod, the nearest thing to approval he ever gave the outside world. We climbed, the river's breath following us like a damp animal, and entered a narrow landing where two labourers stood with their caps in hand beside a stretcher and its solemn freight. Holmes acknowledged them with a bow that was somehow neither perfunctory nor sympathetic, but purely observant, and moved past into the office. The room was 12 feet by 10, with a single barred window over the Thames, a mean grate, a desk that had suffered a sacrilege of ink, and the rug marred by a half-boot of pitch. Holmes neither flung himself upon the corpse nor pounced upon the desk. He halted at the window as a listener halts at the faintest thrum of a distant string. For half a minute he did not touch a thing. Then he opened the violin case he had brought and produced not music, but implements, a neat roll of wire, a small grapnel, and a length of fine cord on a wooden bobbin. He placed them upon the sill as a surgeon lays out steel. From his pocket he took a paper envelope and tipped a dusting of pale grains into his palm, breathing lightly, so that the motes waltzed and settled where his breath condensed upon the cold latch. "Rosin," I murmured. "Of a particular temper," said he. With the least possible pressure he tried the latch and the bar. Both yielded smoothly, and when he lifted his finger, there remained upon the metal a faint crescent, as if a tacky lip had kissed and withdrawn. His tape flicked out. He measured the crescent and turned to the black half-print in the rug. "The scale agrees," he said. "A man who will not risk a whole foot will sometimes risk a toe. Note, Watson, that the mark leans toward the river, not the door." "With the window barred and latched from within," Lestrade objected, more from duty than conviction. "Which is the very recommendation of the method," Holmes returned. He leaned through the bars so far that I seized his belt lest he topple into the woolly grey without. His gloved hand travelled along the underside of the sill and the outer face of the iron. When he drew it back, there glittered upon the tips of his fingers minute black grains. He crushed and sniffed. "Boatyard pitch and coal dust. This pitch is not native to the room. It has visited." At his nod, the labourers bore the stretcher to the landing. Holmes approached the desk. With tweezers he teased at the ragged stub of the torn ledger leaf until a single fibre yielded. He held it against the light. "Torn in haste, but not by a shaking hand," he murmured. "And the ink, Watson. Observe the ring where it has pooled. Not a starburst, but the soft rim of a thing decanted. Our intruder prefers the quiet gesture." A slight figure hovered in the doorway, pale as a candle's gutter. "Pettigrew," said Lestrade, "the junior clerk." "Come in, Mr. Pettigrew," Holmes invited without turning. "Who attends to this window?" "I do, sir," the youth stammered. "Mr. Phippen would have it wiped nightly. The river eats iron." "And last evening?" "I barred it myself, sir. The fog was rolling up, and Mr. Phippen, said the smell turned his stomach." Holmes's gaze slid down and up the young man's sleeves. "You play the violin," he observed gently. "Amateur, conscientious. Your rosin is cheap and crumbly. It has colonized your cuffs and your pen case. Yet there is none upon the latch you claim to have handled. There is, however, a gum upon it that is not yours, rosin cut with pitch, applied by a finger that preferred not to leave a naked print." Pettigrew's mouth worked. "I left at 9, sir. Mr. Phippen meant to work late." "Just so." Holmes crouched at the rug's edge. "A carpet ending short of the skirting keeps a diary in dust. Observe, Inspector, the path from desk to door is a whisper, from desk to window a footfall. Our visitor had the bars in his mind while he killed." Lestrade scowled at the key that had been found in the dead man's pocket, as if the bit might confess. "Visitor, with the door locked and the key on the victim?" "You possess, Inspector, a faith in pockets that would honour a curate," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Let us ask the tide what it knows." We went down into the raw breath of the river. The fog dragged against the piles. Something moved out there, perhaps a moored hull, turning in its sleep. Holmes stood upon the slime-dark stones and considered the masonry where, by Macready's account, a barge had nudged. He cast the little grapnel. It kissed the water, sank, and came up empty. He cast again. The hooks scraped wood. At the third trial he drew a slim, wet cord from the black, like a spider drawing its own thread from the well of itself. He laid it along his palm, then looked up to the barred square of the window above. "There is our thread," he said softly. "Now we must find the spider." "Aloysius Kern," I ventured, thinking of the rival's yard. "Or any hand that knows a barge's patience," he returned. "Inspector, send for Mr. Lionel Lyle and for Mr. Kern. Advise Mrs. Lydia Harrow that we shall wait upon her later. First, we require the testimony of the pitch." Macready had lingered like a guilty conscience. "I heard the bump at 1:15, like I told you," he said. "Could be any lighter feeling her way." "You will show me," Holmes replied, "where you kept watch between 5 and the finding, and where your lantern stood when you went upstairs." The man pointed out his station. Holmes measured the span from pile to wall, set the bobbin spinning, and with a deft movement sent the grapnel to catch the outer bar. He did not haul. He paid out line until it lay along the sill like a shadow. The rod of his cane lifted toward the office above. A man at water level, with patience, a tacky glove, and a practised touch, might do from without what a man on land cannot from within, he said. "It is not proof, it is a path, and it leads us to hands accustomed to tar." Lestrade's breath smoked in the wet air. "And meanwhile?" "Meanwhile," said Holmes, gathering the cord into loops, "we shall compare tars. There is more personality in pitch than in handwriting. Come, Watson, bring the envelope. The river has told us how. We must ask the ledger why and Mr. Lyle whether." Lionel Lyle arrived at the wharf not long after we had summoned him, a trim, precise fellow with the pallor of one accustomed to ledgers and the security of order. His umbrella was furled so tightly it might have been a walking stick, and he greeted Lestrade with the circumspection of a man measuring every word against the consequences of uttering it. Holmes, who had been pacing the length of the wharf and studying the river as if it were a page written in invisible ink, paused and regarded the newcomer with an unreadable expression. "You were Mr. Phippin's partner?" Holmes asked, without preamble. "For 15 years," said Lyle, his voice thin but steady. "A sound business, importing dried fruits, spices and oils. We were steady, profitable, and respected." His eyes flickered toward the warehouse window above, then back to Holmes. "And now, this horror." "Your partner was troubled of late," Holmes observed. "A discrepancy in the accounts." Lyle's composure faltered. He drew a handkerchief, dabbed at his lips and replaced it carefully. "A minor imbalance, nothing to excite alarm. Mr. Phippin was fastidious, over-fastidious. He fretted more than the matter warranted." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet, a page is missing from the ledger, torn with haste. Can you tell us what it contained?" Lyle hesitated. His fingers tightened on the umbrella shaft. "It would be conjecture. I had not examined it since yesterday afternoon." Holmes allowed the silence to grow until the man shifted uneasily. "Mr. Lyle," he said at last, "you are a cautious soul. Conjecture does not sit easily upon your tongue, yet you know well enough what was written there, for you had entered it yourself. The missing page concerned a consignment from Trieste. Your handwriting bears the same angular flourish in the balances. I have seen the remaining folios." Lyle's face blanched. "You examined the books?" "Enough to see what was absent. The question is not whether you knew, but whether you feared that others might." Before Lyle could frame a reply, a heavy tread announced the arrival of another visitor. Aloysius Kern strode into view, a barrel of a man with a voice like a dockside foghorn. His coat smelt strongly of tar and rope, and his boots left damp traces upon the planks. He acknowledged Lestrade with a curt nod, and cast Holmes a glance of mingled hostility and curiosity. "You've been quick to drag me from my work," Kern rumbled. "If this is about Ambrose Phippin's death, I'll tell you plain, I had no hand in it. We quarrelled, yes, but over figs, not blood." Holmes's smile was thin. "Quarrels over figs are seldom mortal, Mr. Kern, though passions may be stirred by less." "You keep barges moored at this stretch?" "2 of them. The tide's master here, not me. If a hull bumped the piles at dawn, it was no trick of mine." Holmes stooped and drew from his pocket the cord and grapnel he had earlier retrieved. He held the damp fibre up so that Kern could see the pitch-stained strands. "You will forgive the liberty, but this line was left whispering against the window bars of Phippin's office. Its tar speaks the dialect of the yards. Would you care to test whether it answers to your vessels?" Kern's brow darkened. "You accuse me." "I ask," Holmes corrected. "Tar, like handwriting, differs by source. A modest comparison will suffice." He turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Inspector, have one of your men secure samples from Kern's ropes and those of the neighbouring yards. We shall know before the evening whether the river's thread leads to this man's hand." Kern bristled, muttered a curse under his breath, and stalked a pace away, arms crossed like a fortress gate. Lyle, by contrast, grew more nervous with each word. His umbrella trembled slightly as if it shared his agitation. Holmes noted both reactions with equal interest. At length he addressed Lyle again. "You will forgive a blunt question, sir. Did you benefit, financially, socially, or otherwise, by the removal of your partner?" The little man flushed, then shook his head violently. No, I depended on him. He knew the men of the river. I was but the figures behind a desk." His eyes darted toward Kern, then back to Holmes. "If there is guilt here, it lies nearer the barges than the ledgers." Holmes's expression gave no clue as to whether he accepted or rejected the claim. Instead, he signalled me to follow him back into the warehouse. We climbed once more to the office, leaving Lestrade to manage the uneasy witnesses. Inside, the fog had pressed closer to the window, dimming the light until the chamber seemed cloistered from the world. Holmes took up the ledger and held the binding against his ear, thumbing it swiftly. "Note, Watson, how the torn stub rubs faintly upon the page before and after, leaving a shadowy impress. A soft lead pencil leaves ghosts, so too does rough tearing, if we apply the least dusting of lampblack." He drew a small vial from his pocket and blew across the surface, or observe the faint digits reappearing. I bent close. The outline of numbers emerged, blurred but unmistakable. 500 crates, olive oil, Trieste shipment, I read aloud. Precisely, and yet in the balance beside it, a mark suggesting deficit. Phippen feared fraud, possibly smuggling under cover of his imports. The missing page would have revealed the leak. His death silenced him before he could speak further. Holmes straightened, his eyes glittering. "Our task now is twofold, to match the rope to its barge and to determine who profited from that silence. The clerk, Pettigrew, is a pawn, too timorous for violence. Lyle trembles at exposure but lacks the sinew. Kern has the means, the tar, the temper. Yet we must be wary, Watson. The river carries more than one current." From below, Lestrade's voice carried up the stair. "Holmes, the men are restless. Do you mean to keep them waiting?" Holmes closed the ledger, his face unreadable. "Tell them the tide waits for no man, Inspector, and neither shall we. Tonight, Watson, we return to Baker Street. I must compare these grains with my collection. Tomorrow, the river will yield its verdict." As we left the warehouse, the fog thickened, swallowing the outlines of men and barges alike, so that all became shadows upon water. I felt the weight of unseen eyes and the slow, patient breathing of the Thames, as if it too conspired to hide the truth until Holmes was ready to wrest it free. The fog accompanied us all the way back to Baker Street, clinging to our coats and insinuating itself even through the cab's shutters, as if reluctant to release us from the grasp of the river. Holmes spoke scarcely a word on the return journey. He sat with arms folded, chin sunk upon his chest, eyes half closed, yet glittering now and then, when the lamplight caught them, the way a knife edge betrays its sharpness in a brief flash. I knew better than to intrude upon such silence. It was his habit to allow the data to settle like silt in still water until the pattern beneath showed clear. Once within our familiar rooms, Holmes laid the ledger on the table and at once spread upon a sheet of paper the black grains he had collected at the Wharf. From another drawer he produced a neat tray of powders and samples, each labelled with a minute hand. He poured small heaps side by side, the grains of tar and pitch resembling black pearls against the white. He regarded them with as much intensity as any jeweller might bestow upon diamonds. "Watson," he said softly, "note the sheen here. Common pitch used for the preservation of lighter ropes. Now compare this fragment, duller, with minute streaks of coal ash. This belongs to Kern's yard. The rope from the Wharf bears precisely that admixture. Unless coincidence has grown suddenly fertile, we have a direct kinship between the line at Phippen's window and Kern's stock." "You believe, then," I said, leaning closer, "that Kern himself or one of his men placed it?" Holmes's fingers drummed upon the tabletop. "It is more than belief, less than proof. Consider the rope, smeared with resin, allowed a hand at water level to draw back the latch from outside the bars. The half-print of pitch upon the carpet corroborates the manoeuvre. Yet who ascended to commit the fatal blow? Kern is burly, unsubtle. He might wield a bar, but could he enter and depart with such stealth? Possibly. Still, I mistrust conclusions that arrive too eagerly. Someone may have borrowed his signature without his leave. I watched him gather the powders once more into their glass tubes, his motions quick, precise, almost impatient. He then returned to the ledger, lifting the lamp so that the light fell obliquely across the ghostly impressions of the missing page. 500 crates of oil, Watson, is not a trifle. A deficit here suggests an illicit siphoning of goods sufficient to line a pocket heavily. But whose? Lyle trembles at exposure, Kern at accusation. The clerk Pettigrew quails before both. Yet there is another figure whose hand we have not yet examined closely, the sister, Mrs. Harrow. I looked up sharply. Phippin's sister. Surely grief alone explains her agitation. Grief explains tears, but not always reticence. She admitted her brother spoke of a discrepancy, yet she claimed ignorance of its nature. Why mention it at all, unless to impress upon us that she knew more than she revealed? A widow in Bayswater does not move oil from Trieste, yet she may benefit indirectly if her household or debts press her. At that moment Lestrade, who had tramped behind us from the cab in his dogged way, entered with hat still in hand. "You've been at your powders again, Mr. Holmes. Well, what have you?" Holmes regarded him with a faint smile. "Proof enough to warrant a visit to Mrs. Harrow. We must learn what Ambrose Phippin confided to his blood that he feared to share with his partner." Lestrade grunted. "If you fancy it will help, but I warn you she's a respectable lady, and I doubt she'll stomach much prying." Holmes was already donning his coat again. "On the contrary, Inspector, she will welcome it, if only to clear herself of suspicion she does not yet know lies upon her doorstep." We travelled that evening to Bayswater, the fog thinning at last into a raw drizzle that pattered against the cab's roof. Sisticton Harrow residence was genteel, the sort of house where piety and order are expected to mask the realities of finance. Mrs. Lydia Harrow received us in a dimly lit drawing-room, her black gown and pale features arranged with a studied composure. She was perhaps in her late 30s, handsome in a subdued fashion, with eyes that flickered more than they met one's gaze. "My brother's death is a cruelty I can scarce endure," she said, motioning us to sit. "If you must speak of business, pray be quick. The house is heavy with mourning." Holmes bowed with his peculiar courtesy. "You have our sympathy, madam. Yet it is in pursuit of justice for your brother that I must trespass upon your grief. You told Inspector Lestrade that Mr. Phippin feared a discrepancy in his accounts. Might you elaborate?" She clasped her hands more tightly. "He said little, only that some figures would ruin him if they proved true. He was secretive. Always he carried his worries alone." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And yet he shared them with you. Did he name the source of this ruin?" Her eyes fell. "No, he spoke vaguely of the river, of men who would stop at nothing. I begged him to tell Lionel Lyle, but he refused. He said Lyle was too timid, that the burden was his alone." "Did he ever speak of Kern?" Holmes asked quietly. At this she started ever so slightly. "That man? They quarrelled, yes. Ambrose thought him coarse, untrustworthy." "But if you imply—" Holmes lifted a hand. "I imply nothing, but you will forgive me if I ask one more question. Your brother left you a provision in his will?" A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "Naturally, I am his nearest kin." Holmes inclined his head and let the matter rest. When at last we had taken our leave and were once more in the cab, I could not resist. "Holmes, surely you do not suspect her, a lady of such refinement?" Holmes's smile was grim. "Refinement, my dear Watson, is a varnish easily purchased, and it often conceals rougher wood beneath. She fears something, of that I am certain. Whether it is guilt or merely knowledge, we must yet determine. The missing page may not have disappeared at Kern's hand, but by another who understood its significance. We tread among shadows, and the river is not the only thing that runs deep." He leaned back, eyes closed, fingers steepled. "Tomorrow, Watson, we return to the wharf. The river has lent us its whisper. We must now compel it to speak." The following morning broke with a sharp, clean light after the suffocating fog of the day before, as though the city itself had drawn a deep breath and cleared its throat. The air carried the scent of damp stone and coal smoke, yet the clarity brought no comfort to Holmes. He paced before the hearth like a caged hound, until the clock struck 9, when Lestrade arrived, red-eyed and irritable from a night of dispatches and reports. Without pausing for more than a sip of coffee, Holmes swept us both toward the waiting cab that was to return us to the river. Merchant's Wharf appeared altered in the daylight, less a haunt of shadows and more a structure of simple timber and brick, though the Thames still lapped at its piles with a voice that seemed to conceal secrets. Holmes directed Lestrade to summon both Kern and Lyle once more, for he intended to conduct what he called a modest experiment in veracity. Meanwhile he set me to assist in examining the window from without, where at low tide the stones beneath were bare and slick. With remarkable agility for one so spare, Holmes clambered down and studied the sill. He produced from his pocket the thin cord and grapnel recovered the previous day. With my help, he reattached it to the iron bar. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how with a judicious tug the latch may be lifted, and with another the bar depressed. A hand at water level could accomplish what a key within the pocket seemed to forbid. Thus the sanctity of the locked room dissolves." I watched in astonishment as the mechanism yielded exactly as he described. The window swung inward a finger's breadth, then closed again with the faintest click. Holmes retrieved the line and tucked it away, his eyes glinting. "Now, if the rope matches Kern's tar, we have strong circumstantial proof. Yet proof must be nailed to motive, else it floats." By then Lestrade had shepherded both men into the warehouse office. Kern's bulk seemed almost to fill the space, while Lyle perched near the desk, umbrella once more clutched like a weapon of defence. Holmes stood between them, the faintest smile on his lips. "Gentlemen," he began, "yesterday we found a rope smeared with tar affixed to this very window. Samples of your yard ropes have been compared with the residue. The pitch speaks plainly. It is of Kern's yard. Do you deny it?" Kern swore, his fists curling. Aye, it may be mine, but any dog on the river could have cut a length and used it. I never set foot in this cursed office that night." Holmes's gaze shifted to Lyle. "And you, sir, do you still deny knowledge of the missing page?" Lyle's composure quavered. "I deny nothing save implication. Yes, I knew the figures concerned the Trieste shipment, but Ambrose was secretive to the end. He suspected someone was siphoning stock, and he meant to confront them. He would not say whom." Holmes inclined his head. "A curious loyalty to conceal from your partner what you revealed to your sister." Lyle blinked. His sister? He confided in Lydia? Holmes allowed the silence to thicken until the man coloured and dropped his gaze. Then he spoke with sudden precision. "The question before us is who profited by Ambrose Phippin's silence. The page vanished. Phippin died. Someone feared exposure. Mr. Kern had the means to enter from the river. Mr. Lyle had the knowledge of what was missing. Mrs. Harrow had the inheritance. Which of you found the courage to act?" The two men bristled, yet neither spoke. Holmes suddenly moved to the desk, knelt, and lifted the rug's corner. From beneath he withdrew a splinter of wood, stained faintly with tar. He held it aloft. "This," he said, "was pressed beneath the carpet by a heavy heel, a fragment of pine such as composes Kern's barge planking. The murderer carried the river into this room with him." Kern exploded in protest. "Anyone could have brought a splinter." Holmes regarded him coolly. "True, and that is why we must turn to the second question, the motive. Who benefited most from 500 missing crates of oil? Not the widow, who knew little of commerce, not the clerk, who lacked both courage and cunning. No, the profit lies with one who balanced the books and could disguise the theft. Mr. Lyle, the figures whispered against you. Lyle leapt up, pale as parchment. I swear to you, I never... He broke off, eyes darting to the ledger. I only wished to delay exposure until I could put matters right. It was Kern. Kern threatened us. He said he would drive us from the wharf if we did not cut him in. Kern roared, lunging forward, but Lestrade and his men held him back. Holmes raised a hand. Enough. The truth is near, yet not complete. We have rope from Kern's yard, figures from Lyle's hand, and silence from Mrs. Harrow. Until we align these strands, the knot will not hold. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, hold both men under suspicion. Tonight I shall pay a second call upon Mrs. Harrow. There is a missing page yet to be found, and I suspect it has not travelled far. As we left the warehouse, the river glinted under the pale sun, no longer cloaked in fog, yet no less secretive. Holmes walked swiftly, his voice low so only I might hear. Watson, remember this. When a page is torn, it is not always destroyed. Sometimes it is kept as a talisman, a guarantee, a weapon. Mrs. Harrow's tremor was not grief, but fear. Tonight we shall see what she guards in her black gown's pocket. I felt a chill despite the sunshine. Holmes's words carried the weight of inevitability. The case was tightening, each clue drawing us nearer to the revelation, though whether it would point to Kern's brawn, Lyle's cunning, or the widow's secret, I could not yet guess. Holmes, however, strode with the certainty of one who already saw the design emerging from the weave. The evening found us once again in Bayswater, where the drizzle of the morning had given way to a raw wind that rattled the lamp-posts and drove the few pedestrians quickly to shelter. Mrs. Harrow received us with a cool composure that betrayed no surprise at Holmes's second visit. She was dressed in the same sombre black, though I observed that her fingers, slender and pale, toyed ceaselessly with the hem of her sleeve, a small but telling sign of unease. Holmes declined refreshment and stood before the fire, his tall figure cast into sharp relief against the glow, his gaze fixed upon her with the intensity of a surgeon about to perform an incision. "Madame," he said, in his most courteous tone, "I regret disturbing your grief yet again, but I believe you hold in your possession something which belonged to your brother." A page torn hastily from his ledger. Her composure wavered, the hand at her sleeve tightening. "What makes you imagine such a thing?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "When we last spoke, you betrayed knowledge of a deficit your brother feared. He confided this to you, yet you professed ignorance of the details. That contradiction suggested you knew more than you revealed. This afternoon, while in your presence, I noted the faintest crinkle of folded paper in your gown pocket, though you were not carrying correspondence. The shape, the stiffness, it was a page, madam, and I believe it was taken from the ledger." Her breath quickened, and she rose, turning toward the mantelpiece as though to steady herself. "You see too much, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I have the page. My brother gave it to me 3 nights ago. He pressed it into my hand and bade me keep it safe. He said if anything befell him, this would tell the truth. I did not speak of it because I feared what it might reveal, and feared what those men might do if they knew I had it." She moved to a small escritoire, unlocked a drawer, and withdrew a folded leaf of paper, yellowed at the edge where it had been wrenched from binding. Holmes received it with a bow, unfolded it, and examined the columns of figures with an expression that brightened with every line. "Excellent," he murmured. "The handwriting is Phippin's own, the entries meticulous, and here the deficit clearly marked. 500 crates from Trieste entered upon the books, yet only 300 delivered. 200 vanished in transit, with false notations disguising the absence. The fraud is plain, but note, Watson, how the false figures correspond precisely with Mr. Lyle's hand elsewhere in the ledger. Phippen discovered his partner's tampering. He tore this page to preserve it, and for that foresight he was silenced. Mrs. Harrow covered her face with her hands. "You mean Lionel Lyle killed him?" Holmes's voice softened but remained firm. "I mean he had the strongest motive, yet motive is not dagger nor iron bar. The hand that struck may have belonged to another. Consider, Watson, the rope from Kern's yard, the tarred half-print, the splinter of pine. These point to Kern's world, not Lyle's. The two may have been in collusion. One wielded the pen, the other the rope. But who wielded the weapon? That is the last stitch we must sew." At that instant a commotion sounded in the hall. A servant, white-faced, rushed in. "Ma'am, there is a man. He forced his way inside." Holmes wheeled toward the door as a heavy step approached. To our astonishment, Lionel Lyle himself burst into the drawing-room, his umbrella gone, his thin features drawn taut with desperation. He started at the sight of Holmes and myself, and his gaze fixed upon the paper in Holmes's hand. "So you have it," he said hoarsely. "The page. I knew Ambrose had hidden it. He trusted no one, not even me. Give it here." Holmes slipped the page into his pocket with a motion so swift it might have vanished into air. "You come late, Mr. Lyle. We know its contents. You falsified the figures to cover the siphoning of goods, and your partner discovered you." Lyle trembled, his lips working. "I never meant for him to die. I thought only to delay, to put the accounts right again. It was Kern. Kern pressed me, threatened exposure if I did not bend. He used the rope. He entered from the river. I swear it." Holmes's gaze was unreadable. "And yet the torn page was in your possession until last night. Why did you not give it to the police?" I feared Kern, and I feared disgrace." Holmes stepped forward, his tone suddenly sharp as a whip. "You feared more than disgrace, sir. You feared the gallows, for it was not Kern who tore the page, it was you, and you who profited from concealing it until now. Whether you also wielded the weapon we shall soon learn, but your hand is already dark with guilt." At this, Lyle collapsed into a chair, sobbing, his mask of composure shattered. Mrs. Harrow recoiled, horrified. Holmes gestured for me to steady the man while he summoned Lestrade, who had followed our cab discreetly and now entered with 2 constables. "Take him, Inspector," Holmes said crisply. "The ledger page secures the charge of fraud. As to the murder, we must yet confirm whether he acted alone or with Kern's aid. The river holds part of the answer, and it will speak before long." Lestrade clapped irons upon the broken man and led him away, leaving the drawing-room in shocked silence. Holmes remained standing, his gaze upon the fire, his fingers steepled in thought. After a long pause, he turned to me. "You see, Watson, the pattern emerges. The torn page was the fulcrum, the rope, the lever. Lyle sought to conceal, Kern to profit, and Phippen to resist. Between them, a man died. But I am not satisfied. There is a subtlety, yet unaccounted for. Why, if Lyle feared discovery, did he not destroy the page at once? Why entrust it to his sister, unless he thought to use her as an unwitting shield, or unless there is still another hand guiding this current?" His eyes gleamed with the light of pursuit. "Tomorrow we return to the river at nightfall." The murderer grew bold beneath fog and tide. "There in the dark we shall lay a snare. And if my reasoning holds, Watson, the true hand behind Ambrose Phippen's death will reach for the river once more. And we shall be waiting." The following day moved with a tension that seemed to stretch every hour, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes passed the morning in restless silence, seated at the table with the recovered page spread before him, and his violin lying idle at his side. He neither touched the bow nor played a note, but tapped the instrument's body with a fingertip whenever his thoughts quickened. I ventured no questions, for I knew the rhythm of his mind. The surface calm concealed a storm of deductions gathering strength. At last, in the late afternoon, he rose abruptly and declared that our presence would be required once more at Merchant's Wharf. This time, not for inspection, but for strategy. We arrived just as the lamps along the river began to glow dimly through the rising mist. Lestrade awaited us, his patience already thin, for he had spent the day dealing with the bureaucracy of charges against Lionel Lisle, who now languished in a cell at Bow Street. "If you've dragged me out in this damp for another experiment with tar and rope, Mr. Holmes," he muttered, "you'll find me short of temper." Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "Not experiment, Inspector. Demonstration. The guilty man, if he believes himself unsuspected, will return to the scene. A current, once chosen, flows in one direction. We need only wait until the tide of his desperation brings him back." He instructed Lestrade to conceal 2 constables within the warehouse itself, while he and I took our places on the shadowed stones beneath the piles. The evening deepened, the fog drifting thick and heavy, and the river's murmur grew louder with the turning tide. Holmes crouched beside me, the damp seeping through the stones, his eyes fixed upon the barred window above, as though it were a stage curtain about to rise. We waited in silence, save for the lapping of water and the occasional groan of timber as barges shifted against their moorings. At last, near midnight, a faint scrape reached our ears, the sound of a boat's prow nudging wood. Holmes's hand gripped my arm lightly, warning me to stillness. Through the veil of mist I discerned a dark figure, half concealed by the shadow of a barge, moving with the deliberate caution of one who knows both the water and the danger of discovery. A line uncoiled softly, the grapnel rising toward the bars of the window. Holmes's breath was scarcely more than a whisper. "There, Watson, the river's hand reaches once again." The grapnel caught. A tug lifted the latch, another depressed the bar, and the window swung inward by a hair's breadth. The figure steadied himself, preparing to climb. In that instant, Holmes rose with sudden force, his voice ringing out sharp and clear. "Hold, sir! The tide does not wash away guilt so easily." The man froze, then sprang to retreat, but Lestrade's constables burst from within the warehouse at Holmes's signal. The fugitive twisted, casting a desperate glance toward the river, but a lantern flare revealed his face, and I started in astonishment. It was neither Lisle nor Kern. It was Pettigrew, the pale and trembling clerk. He struggled like a rat in a trap, but the constables seized him, dragging him onto the stones where Holmes stood, with arms folded. The youth's features contorted in terror, his voice breaking. I only wanted to recover the page. Please, you must believe me." Holmes's gaze was as cold as the tide that lapped about our boots. "The page was already safe, Pettigrew. It was never you who feared exposure, it was Lisle. Yet here you are, returning with rope and pitch. Pray explain yourself." The boy's eyes darted wildly. Kern forced me. He said if I didn't help I'd lose my place, that I'd never work on the wharf again. He gave me the rope, told me how to use it. I only fetched the page after Mr. Phippen was struck. I never raised a hand against him." Holmes regarded him in silence for a long moment, then spoke with sudden intensity. "Watson, note the flaw. If Pettigrew only sought the page, why return tonight when Lisle is already arrested and the fraud exposed? No, he returns because something else is missing, something Phippen possessed besides the torn leaf. The page was but a token. There is more concealed within that office, and Pettigrew knows it. Lestrade, impatient, demanded the truth. Pettigrew crumpled, sobbing. There was a second sheet. Phippen wrote down names, ships, dates, a full account of Kern's dealings and the crates that vanished. He hid it beneath the floorboard by the desk. I swear it. I meant to take it, to destroy it before anyone found it. If Kern learned I betrayed him... Holmes cut him short. So you betray him twice over, first by obeying, then by confessing. Weakness, Watson, is as fatal a vice as malice. He turned to Lestrade. Recover the hidden sheet. It will confirm whether Kern was partner or pawn. Pettigrew shall answer for his role, though his guilt is of cowardice more than cruelty. Within the hour, Lestrade's men had prized up the board and found a folded paper, ink smudged but legible. Holmes examined it beneath the lantern, his face grim. Here are the entries. Consignments diverted, barges unrecorded, payments noted. Kern's name recurs again and again. The clerk was a tool, the partner the forger, but the brute who wielded the iron bar was none other than Aloysius Kern. The night wind rose, scattering the fog, and the river gleamed darkly as though in assent. Lestrade's expression hardened. That settles it. Kern will not bluster his way free this time. Between Lyle's figures, Pettigrew's confession, and this sheet, we've the rope to hang him. Holmes pocketed the paper, and hang he must, though it is a sordid rope spun of greed, fear, and silence. Phippen fought against it, and for that he paid the ultimate price. Tomorrow we shall confront Kern. Let us see how the river's son defends himself when dragged before the shore of justice. We returned to Baker Street in the early hours, the city still wrapped in mist, but my mind burned too brightly for sleep. I could not shake the image of the trembling clerk caught between loyalty and terror, nor the certainty in Holmes's voice as he spoke of Kern's guilt. Yet I knew well enough that Holmes never declared the game finished until the very last piece lay upon the board, and that the coming confrontation would reveal the truth in all its stark and terrible simplicity. The morning that followed was brittle with cold, the kind of sharp air that made every word and every sound seem more distinct. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I joined him, though the untouched plate before him showed his mind had been far from appetite. Spread across the cloth were the recovered sheets, both the torn page and the list of consignments taken from beneath Phippen's floorboard. He had marked them with pencil, circling dates, connecting figures with rapid lines that gave the appearance of a web in which Kern was caught at every turn. His pipe smoked languidly upon the mantel, forgotten between bursts of thought, until at last he rose with decision and sent for a cab. At Bow Street, Lestrade awaited us with grim satisfaction. "We've Kern under lock, Mr. Holmes. He raged when we brought him in, swore blind he'd see us all damned before he'd confess. But he's quieter now. Do you mean to question him?" Holmes's eyes flashed. "Indeed. But it is not the constable's question that breaks a criminal's defence. It is the criminal's own contradictions. Bring him in." Kern entered between two warders, his massive frame barely contained by the narrow doorway. His hair was damp with sweat, his jaw set like a block of granite, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as they met Holmes's. He sat heavily, folding his arms across his chest, as though to shield himself against the weight of suspicion. Holmes stood across from him, every inch the conductor poised before an unwilling instrument. "Mr. Kern, you are accused of conspiring with Lionel Lyle to defraud your late neighbour Ambrose Phippen, and of silencing that gentleman when he uncovered your dealings. You will doubtless deny this. That is expected, yet before you do, I invite you to consider the evidence arrayed against you." Kern snorted. "Evidence? The rope, you mean? Any man might have used a rope from my yard. Lyle's the one with the pen. Lyle's the thief. He sought me out, begged for my help, said Phippen was too sharp, that he'd be ruined unless I lent a hand. I told him I'd have no part of it, and now you'd lay a murder at my feet because of tar and pitch. You'll need more than that, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's smile was faint, almost indulgent. "And more is precisely what we have. The hidden sheet from Phippin's office, where your name occurs beside every vanished consignment, payment tallies, ship schedules, dates matched against your barges. You see, fraud leaves footprints, as surely as pitch leaves prints upon a rug. And when Phippin tore the page to guard against your betrayal, you, or your accomplice, entered by river to still him forever. But you erred, Mr. Kern. A splinter of pine lodged beneath the carpet, a tarred print pointed to the window, and a trembling clerk spoke of your threats." Kern's eyes flared with sudden anger, then narrowed again. Pettigrew, that pale rat? He'd say anything to save his own hide. If you hang a man on the word of a frightened boy, the river will laugh at you. Holmes leaned forward, his voice cutting like a blade. "Not his word alone, sir, but the convergence of every fact. Only a man at home upon the water could have used the rope with such surety. Only one with barges at his command could have come and gone unseen in the fog. And only one who had pressed a timid clerk into obedience could inspire such terror. It is not the river that laughs, Mr. Kern. It is justice." The silence that followed was heavy. Kern shifted in his seat, the cords in his neck straining, his breath coming thick and uneven. For a moment I thought he might launch himself across the table, but instead he sagged backward, muttering curses under his breath. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "Inspector, you have here a man who cannot account for the rope, cannot deny the ledger, and cannot escape the testimony of his own accomplice. He will stand before a magistrate and answer. Whether he swung the bar himself or ordered another hand to do so, he is guilty." Lestrade nodded, grimly satisfied, and signalled the warders to remove their prisoner. As Kern was led out, his last words rang through the chamber like a threat. "The river keeps its own secrets. You think you know it, Mr. Holmes, but you don't. You never will." When the door had closed, Holmes stood silent for a long while, his fingers steepled, his gaze far away. At last he turned to me. "You see, Watson, how men deceive themselves. Kern believes the river his ally, but it has betrayed him with every tide. Yet one question lingers. Did Kern strike the blow, or did Lyle? Both had cause, both were entangled. It may be that the iron bar was wielded by the stronger arm, but the design was as much the forger's as the brute's." That afternoon, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. He refused supper, instead pacing with restless energy, the violin at times under his chin, at times discarded upon the table. "We have brought the truth to light," he said, "yet I am not wholly content. There is still an element of this crime that resists arrangement, like a note played slightly off-key. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall revisit the wharf once more. There is something in the tide's rhythm, in the timing of the watchman's report, that troubles me. Until that dissonance resolves, I cannot call the case complete." I could only watch in silence as he moved between the fire and the window, his silhouette stark. Against the evening glow, every line of his figure taut with thought. Outside, the fog once again crept over the city, drawing its grey veil over the streets, as though London itself conspired to conceal what Holmes yet sought to reveal. The following morning dawned leaden, the sky pressed low upon the city, as though a great weight hung suspended above it. Holmes was already at his desk, scribbling rapid notes upon a scrap of paper, his pipe sending out thin threads of smoke that curled and vanished in the draught from the window. His face bore that expression of controlled intensity I had come to recognize as the herald of some impending revelation. He looked up briefly as I entered, his eyes bright with the light of deduction. "Watson, the dissonance I spoke of last night remains, but I believe I have struck the chord that resolves it. The watchman, Macready, claimed he heard a barge nudge the piles at 5:15, and yet saw none through the fog. Another lighterman swore he had watched the warehouse wall for half an hour and saw no vessel approach. 2 witnesses, 2 accounts, irreconcilable at first glance. But what if both spoke the truth? A barge did nudge the piles, yet it was invisible not by distance but by design. I frowned. Invisible, Holmes. In that fog, surely any vessel could vanish from view. Not vanish, he corrected sharply. Concealed. Consider the tide. 5:15, it had turned. A lighter or barge, lashed close under the wharf's shadow, would be shielded from the lighterman's sight, yet still capable of nosing the piles with the current. Our murderer did not arrive from afar. He was already moored, waiting. Before I could reply, a rap at the door announced Lestrade, whose weary countenance betrayed little of triumph. "Kern holds fast to silence," he said grimly. "Lyle blames Kern, Kern blames Lyle, and the clerk blames both. The magistrate wants clarity, Holmes, and I confess I've none left to give him. If you have something, now's the time." Holmes seized his hat. "Then let us return to the river. There is one final scene the Thames must play before the curtain falls. Come, Inspector, bring Macready with us. His ears may yet prove useful." By mid-morning we stood once again at Merchant's Wharf, the tide low, the stones beneath the piles glistening with damp. Macready shuffled uneasily beside Lestrade, his lantern clutched, though the daylight rendered it unnecessary. Holmes paced the edge of the river like a conductor summoning his orchestra, his keen eyes darting from timber to waterline, from mooring ring to rope coil. "Macready," he said suddenly, "stand where you were when you heard the bump upon the piles. Do not embellish. Place yourself precisely." The watchman obeyed, moving to a point near the corner where the wharf wall met the river. Holmes positioned himself beside him, head cocked as though listening to an echo only he could hear. Then he pointed to a thick timber beam that jutted beneath the warehouse floor. "There, Watson. Observe the fresh scrape upon that beam, where a hull pressed close. The barge was tethered directly under the shadow of the wharf. Macready heard it shift with the turning tide, but from the open water the lighterman would see nothing." Lestrade squinted. "So Kern's men hid the barge there, waiting until the fog thickened enough to mask their climb." "Precisely. And when Phippen resisted, the iron bar fell." Holmes crouched, his fingers brushing the damp stone. He lifted them, darkened by a smear of pitch. "Yet one matter remains. This pitch is mixed with resin of a sort not found in Kern's yard alone. There is a foreign quality here, Mediterranean resin, the very same used upon crates from Trieste. Do you not see? The fraud was not merely Kern's brute theft, nor Lyle's penmanship. It was a partnership, forged from necessity. Lyle falsified the figures, Kern transported the stolen goods, and Pettigrew, poor fool, served as messenger. But when Phippen uncovered the scheme, the alliance fractured. Which of them struck the blow, Inspector? That is the question the court will ask." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "And how do you mean to prove it?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "By compelling the guilty hand to betray itself. Tonight, when the tide turns once more, we shall stage a reconstruction. Each man shall be brought here, one at a time, to face the scene of the crime. Memory, Watson, is a treacherous ally. It will betray the liar." That evening, under Holmes's direction, the warehouse became a stage set for revelation. Lamps were lit within, the barred window thrown open, the rope and grapnel positioned as they had been found. Lestrade fetched Lyle first. The man trembled visibly, his composure utterly broken. When Holmes bade him approach the window, he recoiled as though the bars themselves accused him. I never touched it," he whispered. "I cannot bear to look." Next, Kern was brought in, his defiance undiminished. He strode to the window and gripped the bars, rattling them with a strength that made the timbers creak. "A rope! A bar! Child's play!" he sneered. "But you'll not prove I killed him." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Not by your word, perhaps, but by your action." He pointed to Kern's hands, where the tar had left a telltale smudge fresh upon his skin from the beam outside. "Even tonight you could not resist laying your mark where once you climbed. The river has betrayed you again." Kern's face darkened with fury, but Lestrade's men seized him before he could protest further. The room fell silent, save for the muffled lap of water against stone. Holmes stood tall, his expression grave. "It is finished, Watson. Lyle will answer for the fraud, Pettigrew for his cowardly complicity, but Kern will face the law for the murder of Ambrose Phippen. The river concealed him once, but it has yielded every secret in the end. Justice flows, Inspector, even if it must wind through tar and fog to find its course." As Kern was led away, the echo of his curses mingling with the rush of the tide, I felt a deep shiver that no chill air could explain. The case was closing, the pattern revealed, yet in Holmes's eyes I glimpsed not triumph, but a sombre recognition that the river had claimed more than one victim, and that even justice could not wholly cleanse its dark waters. The trial of Aloysius Kern moved swiftly, for the weight of evidence Holmes had unearthed pressed heavily upon the scales of justice. The ledger, the hidden sheet, the tarred rope, and the smudge upon his hands combined to form a chain no barrister could break. Lyle, confronted with his own falsifications, was condemned for fraud, though spared the gallows, his frail constitution and craven spirit marking him as conspirator rather than executioner. Pettigrew, whose cowardice had been exploited by both, was dismissed from the Wharf entirely, his role pitiful yet undeniable. Mrs. Harrow, though questioned, was absolved, her part reduced to the frightened custodian of a page her brother had entrusted to her in desperation. Through it all, Holmes remained detached, as if watching a drama whose ending he had predicted long before the curtain rose. Yet even when the gavel fell and Kern was sentenced to face the rope he had so often handled in life, Holmes's manner betrayed no triumph. He listened to the proceedings with his gaze half turned toward the windows of the court, where the winter light lay thin upon the glass. Only once, when Kern's curses echoed against the chamber's stone, did Holmes's eyes flicker with the faintest glint of satisfaction. For my own part, I felt relief, mingled with the solemn weight of justice. But I also noted the restraint with which Holmes accepted the verdict, as though his mind was still occupied by some unresolved echo of the case. That evening, back in our rooms at Baker Street, I pressed him upon the matter. "Holmes," I said, "surely this affair may be counted among your most complete successes. You unmasked the fraud, traced the rope, and compelled the murderer's own hand to betray him. Yet you do not appear content." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, the lamplight cutting fine lines across his sharp features. "Contentment, my dear Watson, is the province of those who crave closure more than truth. I seek the latter, and though we have secured it in law, I am not wholly certain we have grasped it in philosophy. Kern swung the bar, yes, but only because Lyle's pen made it necessary. Which then is the greater crime, the brute's blow, or the partner's forgery that set events in motion? The world will call Kern a murderer and Lyle a swindler, but I tell you, the distinction is one of law, not of morality. They were twin hands of the same body. His words impressed themselves upon me, though I protested. Surely one who kills must bear a heavier weight than one who deceives. Perhaps, Holmes replied, his gaze far away. But reflect, Watson, had Lyle not falsified the accounts, Phippen would never have torn the page, never summoned his sister in fear, never been marked for silence. Kern's brutality was but the blunt instrument. The true seed lay in Lyle's timid treachery. Fear and greed, those are the architects of crime. The iron bar merely completed their design. We sat for a time in thoughtful silence, the fire crackling, the fog pressing once more against the window panes, as though London herself wished to remind us of the river's endless presence. At length Holmes rose, crossed to the mantel, and drew his bow across the violin. A long, low note filled the room, mournful yet resolute. "The case of Ambrose Phippen is concluded in the eyes of men," he said, "but the river will remember, Watson, long after the rope has done its work. It will whisper of greed concealed beneath figures, of timidity turned to treachery, of strength turned to violence. And perhaps that is fitting. For the Thames carries all of London's secrets, and it has borne another into its depths." I could not help but shudder at his words, though they were spoken with no trace of melodrama. They seemed to me the natural conclusion of all we had witnessed: the fog, the tar, the torn page, the frightened clerk, the desperate widow, and the brute who trusted the river too deeply. Each had played their part, and each had been caught in the tide Holmes had traced with such unerring clarity. When I took up my pen that night to record the affair, I found myself struck not only by Holmes's brilliance, but also by the sense of inevitability that pervaded the case. From the moment Lestrade had entered our sitting room with his coat damp from the wharf, to the instant Holmes revealed the hidden sheet, every step had flowed with the relentlessness of the tide. And though justice had been done, it was not with the clean satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but with the sombre recognition that human weakness, whether in the form of greed, fear, or brute strength, was as constant as the river itself. Holmes, observing me as I wrote, remarked quietly, "Be sure, Watson, that you set down not merely the facts, but the texture of the case. The locked window, the torn page, the pitch upon the carpet, these are details. Yet beneath them lies the truth, that men conspire with circumstance as much as with one another, and that nature itself, the fog, the tide, the river's patience, becomes an accomplice in crime. To omit that would be to misrepresent the case entirely." I promised him I would do so, and he returned to his violin, drawing forth a melody that wove itself around my thoughts as I wrote. The music was low, deliberate, and strangely sorrowful, as though Holmes himself acknowledged that even victory left behind a residue of melancholy. For Ambrose Phippen was dead, and no deduction, however brilliant, could restore him. Thus the matter closed, not with applause or acclaim, but with the quiet scratch of my pen and the slow lament of Holmes's violin. And when at last I laid down my notes, I could not help but think that the case of the murder at the Merchant's Wharf would remain with me not only as a triumph of my friend's intellect, but as a reminder that beneath the surface of commerce, of respectability, of the very river that flows through our city, there runs always the darker current of human frailty. And it is only by men such as Holmes, with eyes keen enough to pierce the fog, that such currents are ever brought to light. The weeks that followed saw the city's attention drawn to other scandals, but in my mind the case of the Merchant's Wharf lingered with uncommon vividness. Holmes, though pressed with new inquiries, seemed to carry it within him too, as one might carry a melody that refuses to fade. He never spoke of Kern after the sentence was carried out, nor of Lyle's disgrace, yet I often found him at the window, gazing through the fog as though seeking some shape upon the river. At last, one evening, as we sat by the fire, I ventured to ask him whether he considered the matter fully resolved. He looked at me with that half-smile which signalled both amusement and seriousness. "Resolved, Watson, in the sense that the law has spoken, and the guilty have met their portion. Yet no case is ever entirely concluded, for crime is but the symptom of the greater malady of human weakness." Ambrose Phippin's fate teaches us this, that greed and fear, though they may take different forms, conspire as surely as two men in a darkened room. Kern's brute force, Lyle's cowardly fraud, Pettigrew's timidity, each alone might have faltered. Together they formed a chain that dragged Phippin beneath the tide. It was not one man's crime, but the alignment of their vices. I reflected on his words, struck by the sombre truth of them. Then what consolation can we take, Holmes, if justice never quite balances the scales? "The consolation, my dear fellow," he replied, "is that truth may yet be uncovered, and by uncovering it we deny evil the cloak it seeks. The river, for all its fog and concealment, yielded up its secret. That is enough for me." He rose then, took up his violin, and played a slow air, deep and resonant. The notes seemed to mingle with the very pulse of London beyond our walls, the rumble of wheels, the faint cries in the street, the eternal breath of the Thames. And as the music lingered in the air, I realized that Holmes, in his own way, was at peace. The case was closed, not because all wounds were healed, but because the truth, however grim, had been laid bare. Thus ends the account of Sherlock Holmes and the murder at the Merchant's Wharf, a tale of shadows and tide, of fraud and violence, and of a detective whose genius shone all the brighter against the fog of the river.